Looks like we're live now, and nothing can stop us. This is Bradley J. I call the show Ignore the Machine now, and I am a champion of the unusual. And our guest is an unusually brilliant and interesting dude. It's Bob Allison, who is a professor at Suffolk University, and my fairly long-time pal now.
Yes.
A very frequent guest on my WBZ radio show, and continues with me now. And we do interesting things from time to time. So I reached out to Bob and said, "What do you got cooking, Bob?" And he said, "Well, it's the Tea Party, man." And so we're going to do a deep dive on the Tea Party, and B, the way that Bob's organization, Rev 250, or Revolution 250, plans to commemorate the event. So how do you want to handle this? You're the pro. Do you want to talk about first the details of the Tea Party? The truths, the myths, the impact, the ramifications, and then we can talk about the way that Rev 250 plans to commemorate.
We could do that, or unless people turn us off by the time I'm done going through all of them.
Or we could just have a cocktail.
Yeah, December 16th is the big day, and there are all kinds of things happening, both at the Tea Party Ships and Museum, and actually tea is being brought from the East India Company to dump. Also, people are encouraged to send in their stale tea, and they'll dump it off on December 16th for the 250th anniversary. And that's going to begin with events at Faneuil Hall, as well as the Old South Meeting House. So Old South is under the auspices of Revolutionary Spaces, and they're putting together this really interesting series of programs all summer. And Faneuil Hall, there will be a meeting of the people, parade down to Griffin's Wharf, now the site of the Intercontinental Hotel, and the site of the Tea Party Ships and Museum, for this extravaganza of dumping the tea. And so it should be a very exciting event for the city.
So we're going to go through this again because that's a lot to unpack. Your organization, Revolution 250, commemorates various events that are related to the revolution. Exactly. This is a big one, the Tea Party.
This is the big one. This is really the first big one. You know, we've been pushing this for years, and the main thing we've done is gotten together organizations that do history and got them really to work together and think, okay, we're part of this big community. The general public doesn't know which organization we are, so let's support each other. And each of these institutions is really a self-supporting entity. You know, there is the Park Service, but they don't actually own the sites or put on much of the programming. It's really these other organizations, and in many cases volunteers, who do this, really are excited about history, and everyone's invited to join and become part of this living history experience. So the Tea Party is the first big event. I know you're about to ask a question, so I'll let you do that.
So what I was going to say is you actually have a podcast, the Rev 250 podcast, which people can subscribe to.
Yeah, Revolution 250. You helped us launch it about almost 3 years ago now. We're now up to 152 episodes, and we've had really interesting guests on, some noted historians like Gordon Wood, Mary Beth Norton, reenactors, and museum people. People who have stories to tell about the revolution. So every Tuesday we go live, and then it's sent out to the wider world, and we have listeners all over the world. People tune in regularly in India and in Germany and Jasper, Georgia, and Neptune City, New Jersey, and all places all around the country and all around the world. So it's very exciting to have this growing network of people interested in the stories of the American Revolution. You know, we thought we'd probably run out of things to say after about episode 5, but here we are, 152 down the road. Our first guest back in September of 2020 was during the pandemic. You remember, was Gordon Wood, eminent historian. We had him back for our 100th anniversary, 100th show. We'll probably have him back for our 200th, and it's really grown from there. So thank you for helping us launch that. You have a great way of getting people to talk and asking the questions that don't occur to me.
Well, thank you. It must be rewarding to you to see it blossom like that.
It is.
That's cool.
It's fun, like what you've been doing with your various travel shows and other things. It's really good to excite people about these stories.
It's good to see that. I really am. Well, it's rewarding to know that you watch them, because when I'm out there doing these things, I have no idea if anybody's going to watch them. Anytime I hear of anybody that does watch, I'm like, oh, okay, you made it worthwhile. So that's cool. So let's
Good.
tell me again what's how this commemoration is going to work, because there's a lot going on. You're saying people can actually take part in the reenactment of the Boston Tea Party in some way?
In some way, yes. There's going to be a meeting of the body of the people at Faneuil Hall.
And that's
And
anyone?
anyone's welcome to join that. Now I know there will be things happening outside. We'll have interpreters, I guess living history interpreters is what they like to call themselves as opposed to reenactors. And it's usually a fun event. It's December, so it's usually really cold. It's often rainy, and seeing thousands of people then marching through the streets. You process from Faneuil Hall to the old State House, just like in 1773. Groups of guys came from these three different places: the Masonic meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern, the Eaton Gill printing shop, and a carpenter's shop, and converged on the Old South Meeting House, and then walked through the streets. So you're following the same route that people were taking on that December night in 1773 down to the waterfront. And the Beaver and the Dartmouth are the two ships currently at the Tea Party Ships and Museum. And that's where the action will take place. They are going to have big screens set up so people can watch this. And it's really an exciting thing to see as they do this reenactment of the dumping of the tea. And as I said, the Tea Party Ships and Museum is encouraging people to send in their stale tea, and they will dump it. And the first year they did this, maybe about 5 years ago, they didn't know what the response would be. Their actually event took longer because they had so much more tea done. Look, people really do want to be involved in this.
Where do you send your tea?
To the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, which is on Congress Street in Boston. I should have had the address, but it's the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. Evan O'Brien is their creative guy, so they're on the Congress Street Bridge. So if you want to send it in, that's where to send it. They also started a program this year. Last year they started marking the graves of participants. There's something like 150 people we know were involved in this, and no one listed them at the time because they would have been arrested. It's really after they saw how things turned out, really after the revolution, that people started compiling a list. And now, if you think your ancestor was involved, also contact Evan O'Brien, E. O'Brien, at BostonTeaPartyShipsAndMuseum.org. It's a long word. And say, this is my ancestor. I think he might have been involved. And they'll be able to tell you. They've started this in partnership with the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Because, someone we know, he was actually living in Boston or he was living nearby, might have been there. And they didn't keep good records at the time, but there are a couple of lists that circulated afterwards. They have about 150 or so documented people, and they've been marking their graves. In fact, in the fall, they're going to Paris to mark one.
Wow.
Someone moved there, and they've been doing them all over Massachusetts, New England. The furthest west they've gone, I think, is Michigan. And as people did move around, and New York. The one place they found people they didn't want the grave marked was in Ontario. For some reason, locals there didn't want this marked, but they've been really an extraordinary travel they have done, marking these graves, also commemorating the people who they knew participated.
Interesting. My people were in New Hampshire.
Okay.
So I don't know if they came all the way down to Boston.
Yeah,
I mean, it was kind of a hump.
Yeah, it would have been a hike, yeah. Some of the people went up to New Hampshire afterward, though, until things cooled off.
Okay. Now, what? So, what about the Native American factor? I'm sure you don't do that.
Well,
how do you deal with that sensitive issue?
This is a sensitive issue because we know the participants disguised themselves, and there are different reports of disguising themselves as Indians. And later on, it becomes they were Mohawk. John Adams calls them Mohawk. I think he was just using that as a generic term. And Mohawks were not Indians from here. They were Indians from upstate New York who had been fighting with the native people in Massachusetts for a long time. And others called them, and they were speaking in sign language. As they put soot on their faces to darken their faces and blankets over their heads. And there's, a couple of people have written really interesting articles about this. Phil Deloria, who's a professor at Harvard, also is a Native American. His father, Vine Deloria, was one of the leading Native American scholars of the 20th century. Has written a book about playing Indian and how this is taking on this role. I think it's really just an effort to disguise themselves and not be recognized. So they're not from around here, they're Indians, and Indians came in and did this. We know there were people who were here, and there are people who knew how to load and unload a ship because they do it very efficiently and expeditiously. So I will leave it to the Tea Party Ships and Museum. We'll actually do a better job explaining this, unpacking this, because it's a sensitive issue, an interesting issue. And so they are disguising themselves, and this was the disguise that comes most readily to hand.
So the Tea Party Museum seems like must be quite an interesting place. I'm not super familiar with it.
Yeah, it is. They've done a good job retelling, getting the history right. So it's not simply a touristy thing. It's not a Disney version. They are fairly sensitive to telling the history and commemorating the history, even though a lot of the other history groups say, well, they're for profit. I have to tell you, they don't make a whole lot of a profit. And they're operated by Historic Tours of America that also operate trolleys around the country. They do a very good job with the history and with telling the story. And it's important for all of us, getting people excited about the story. So it's not simply the Disney version. It is really a serious attempt to get people engaged with the story. You have a recreation of the Old South meeting house you go into, you have a town meeting, and then you go out and you throw the tea off of the ship. They also have a very nice gift shop and a tea shop, Abigail's Tea Room, they call it. And those are open. You can go into those without paying admission to the museum. Well worth going into if you just want to meet someone. And the gift shop also does a very good job. And here I'm not hyping the gift shop, but I think they did have a major change in the way they were exhibiting a year or two ago, and tracing the origins of the tea in China. The one surviving tea chest that they have, actually, they know the wood came from China, so the tea would have been packed in the southern part of China sometime in probably 1772, early 1773, and then shipped to England. And the reason the tea is coming here is the East India Company had gone broke in the process of conquering India. And of course, this is a great thing for the company, but it leaves the company, really the largest corporation in the world, on the verge of bankruptcy. So they go to Parliament for a bailout. And they say, hey, look, we need 15 million pounds or we're going to go bust. I don't think the prime minister or they use the term too big to fail and what would happen if the biggest corporation in the world goes bankrupt. But the prime minister saw an opportunity. He would loan the company 15 million pounds, but in exchange, he got to appoint members of the board of directors. He's not really taking it over, but he's having more of an interest in the company. And then they say, okay, to help you get back on your feet, you have these big warehouses in London filled with tea. If you have too much tea in there and they're going to go bad, we'll let you ship them to North America and they won't have to pay the tax on the tea when you get there. This is the only tea we'll allow to be sold in North America. So the company thinks that's a very good idea. And then in September, the magic number hits at the warehouse. They need to ship this tea. So they commandeer ships that are going to North America. There are 4 on their way to Boston, 4 relatively small ships. There's a bigger one going to New York, a bigger one going to Philadelphia, a bigger one going to Charleston, South Carolina. Each of those gets about 900 to 1,000 chests of tea. Each chest weighs about 200 pounds. Each of the Boston ships gets about 200 to 300 chests of the tea, and off they go. So now the word reaches back here, the tea is coming. The only tea we'll be able to buy is the company's tea. The company, which has just been raping and pillaging India, now is going to control us. And that's really the issue. It's not the king, it's not Parliament, it's the company, and the company in collusion with Parliament. And it's not that we're going to be governed by Parliament, we're going to be governed by the company. Thinking about this trading company that's becoming an empire. John Dickinson, the guy in Philadelphia, writes this pamphlet, talking about what's happened in East India with the company running things in Bengal. Bengal, one of the wealthiest places in the world. They've had a famine for the last 3 years because of the company's policies there. That will happen to us. So we
Wow.
can't let the tea land. So it's a throughout the colonies, merchants are protesting this. And here in Boston, actually in the middle of the summer, biggest tea merchant in Boston was a guy named Richard Clark. And his son had gone off to London in the spring of 1773 to buy tea and discovers the only way we'll be able to sell tea is through the company. So he gets appointed one of the agents to sell the tea. The company designates certain people in each port to sell the tea. And the Clarks are one here, along with Thomas Hutchinson's two sons. And Benjamin Faneuil, Peter Faneuil's brother. Peter Faneuil died about 20 years, 30 years earlier. And a guy named Winslow down in Plymouth. And other ports, other people designated as merchants. Anyway, Jonathan Clark comes home, having a big family reunion at their house on School Street, where the Franklin statue now stands. Suddenly the mob appears, starts tearing the shingles off the house, tearing off the shutters, trying to break down the house. And someone fires a gun out of the upstairs window. The crowd disperses. But they can kind of see this isn't a popular thing. And then a town meeting is assembled the next day. They said, we won't allow the tea to land. Anyone who receives the tea is a traitor. They have to resign. And the governor sends the sheriff to break up the meeting. There are 5,000 people packed into Faneuil Hall. The governor comes in, and these 5,000 people hiss at. I don't know if you've ever been hissed at by that many people. It's really intimidating to the sheriff. He leaves. And the tea agents realize they're stuck. They go to the governor and say, hey, can you help us out? Take possession of the tea. And the governor's council says, no, we're not going to take possession of the tea. It's your problem. And these guys who had agreed they were going to sell the tea realize they can't do that. They feel that they can't resign their commission because they don't get, by the way, they don't get paid until the tea is sold and all the receipts go back to England. Now, meanwhile, as I mentioned, there are these ships in England waiting for they have cargoes ready to go. The tea company says, wait a minute, you have to take our tea. It has priority. So essentially, these ships are commandeered to sail back to America carrying all of this tea. The owners of the ships won't get paid for this until they've unloaded the tea's been sold, they go back to England with the receipts, then they get paid. So these guys are losing out. And it's really just by chance the first of the ships reached Boston at the end of November of 1773. And another ship comes in a few days later. What happens, a big storm had blown up in the Atlantic. The New York ship doesn't arrive until April. The one doesn't get to Philadelphia till the day after Christmas. And the one doesn't get to Charleston, South Carolina until a month or so later. So you have the ships reaching Boston, and the town meeting assembles. They put squads of guys on each ship to make sure nothing gets unloaded. So 25 guys rotate. So every 12 hours, there's a shift change for these guys. They must be guys who knew their way around ships. They probably worked on the docks or worked as sailors. And you and I put in charge of a ship, we really wouldn't know where to start. We'd have a lot of fun, but figuring out where things went, how to keep people on or off. So the town is really taking these ships. They also bring them to Griffin's Wharf, closer to the town. There's a British warship out off Castle Island. They get it away from that, bring it up to Griffin's Wharf. So they're patrolling these ships. They don't want anything unloaded. Now, there's this law in place. This is the technicality. You bring a ship into a British port. You can keep it there for up to 20 days and without having to pay any taxes. After that, you either leave, or if you stay in port, you have to pay taxes. The presumption is, hey, if you're here for that long, you're probably selling stuff, so the cargo has to be taxed. So we know 20 days is the time limit. So they arrive, I think, November the 28th. So we know December 17th, December 16th at midnight is when the clock runs out. The ships either have to unload or sail. And what the town wants is for the ships to sail. The governor says no, they can't sail because they're the East India Company ships. The Governor Thomas Hutchinson says, there's this warship in the harbor. They might stop them from sailing, and the guys who are supposed to sell the tea are really getting kind of terrified because they're being attacked. They go into one of the town meetings and say, hey, this is what we would like to do. The tea has to be unloaded. No, it's really not our fault. The town meeting adjourns. Everyone stays there. And this is really terrifying because we'd gone in to talk to the town meeting. That's the official government of the town of Boston. But now we're at 5,000 really angry people looking at us. People who, as I said, they practically tore down the Clark's house on School Street. They tar and feather people. They have committed other acts of violence. So that's really what's going on with that. So we know 20 days, the clock runs out. We don't know what's going to happen. Will the ships sail, or will the governor force them to be unloaded? And so it happens on December 16th, big mass meeting at the Old South Meeting House, biggest building in town. Faneuil Hall could no longer accommodate these crowds. They have to go to the Old South Meeting House. By the way, I'll just pause here for a moment and say that one thing Revolutionary Spaces has done is put together a really interesting exhibit on political violence in American history. Starting with the Tea Party, which they see as an episode of political violence. It's destruction of property. No one is killed in it. No one is seriously injured in it. But it is this destruction of property. And you see similar episodes before and after. So it's an interesting exhibit thinking about mob action. It's kind of a driving force here. So on the night of December 16th, there was this mass meeting at Old South Meeting House. And someone had sent an emissary, actually John Singleton Copley, the portrait artist, goes out to see if Governor Hutchinson will allow the ships to sail. And the meeting adjourns while he is off. It's apparently a pretty mild day in December. A lot of people have come in from out of town to be part of this meeting. And it's kind of a drizzly day in December, warm enough so people can be outside comfortably, and they're waiting. And then Copley comes back and he says, no, the governor says the ships won't sail. And this is the famous part, when Samuel Adams then turns and says, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. And that apparently is a signal. Someone up in one of the balconies gives a war whoop, and then out in the street there is another war whoop. People had been crowded out in the street to try to listen in on what was happening at the meeting. And then these processions of guys arrive from the Masonic Lodge, from the Eads and Gill printing shop, from a carpenter's shop. And these guys had been planning. These are the ones dressed as Indians. And then they begin this procession down to the waterfront. And the crowd begins filing out of Old South to follow them. Now, meanwhile, at Old South, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Thomas Young, the real leaders, stay there and keep giving speeches. And someone's taking down the speeches so they can be printed in the newspaper. So the next day you look at the newspaper, you say, no, these guys weren't destroying the tea. They were at the Old South making these speeches. Meanwhile, the crowd goes down to Old South, and one by one they go aboard the ships. And they ask each master of the cargo to show them the ship's manifest. Guys go below decks and start hoisting these chests of tea up to the deck. And then on the deck are guys with axes who cut them open, dump them overboard. And the tide is out, so these boxes start piling up next to the ships. And when they're done, they'll go back to the master of the cargo and say, this is what we destroyed. This is what we didn't. And yes, you just destroyed the tea, nothing else. One of the ships, the master says, hey, don't start with my ship because I have a cargo that's on top of the tea. And they say, we'll take care of that. So they actually very carefully unload that cargo onto the dock and then go about destroying the tea. They want to make it clear, we're only destroying the tea. One of the ships, someone broke a lock. Someone goes into town for a locksmith to repair it. So we didn't destroy anything but the tea. Now, there's a guy named O'Connor who is... someone sees him. He had come onto the ship and he's pretending to be scooping up the tea and throwing it overboard. He actually had cut the bottoms out of his pockets. So he's putting his hands in his pockets that are filled with tea and loading them up. So he's loading up his coat with tea. Someone on the dock points him out and says, hey, that guy is stealing tea. And so he tries to get away. Someone grabs him by the collar. He wriggles out of his coat. They take the coat, they cut the lining out to dump the tea overboard. And the next day, they post a notice in the paper that if the person who lost his coat wants to retrieve it, he can find it nailed to the whipping post in Charlestown. I don't know whether he ever picked up his coat or not. But really
Cool
showing,
story.
it goes on for about 45 minutes or so. And even the captain of the British warship notes how orderly it is. It's peaceful, very quiet, too. There's no shouting, huzzahing. They really are very methodically taking out these chests of tea, dumping them overboard. As I said, it was low tide, and the tide starts to come in, and it's a very calm night. So these mounds of tea are rising in the harbor, and someone says, hey, someone may get that tea unless we destroy it. Someone goes out in a rowboat and starts mashing the tea down into the water to put it under. By the way, I'm told that this year on December 16th, the moon and the tide will be the same as they were back in 1773.
That's cool.
Yeah. So then they destroy the tea. Next day, the Governor Hutchinson, is furious because they've committed treason. And this is really what will happen when news gets back to London. I mean, Hutchinson's always worried about that, and this time they've gone too far. He wants to know the names of the people involved. No one can tell him. Meanwhile, the instigators have sent Paul Revere. They've printed up an account of what happened. Must have been setting the type as the tea was being destroyed, and sent Paul Revere off with this to New York. 3 days later, he's in New York, and New York gets the news of the destruction of the tea in Boston. The ship hasn't arrived in New York yet. And then then someone brings the news to Philadelphia, and it gets to Philadelphia the day before Christmas. And it happens that the day after Christmas, the ship bound for Philadelphia reaches the Delaware River. And a delegation goes down to Chester, which is south of Philadelphia, to tell the ship to stop. They bring the captain of the ship and the master of the cargo to Philadelphia, and there he is met by several thousand people. Remember, this is the morning after Christmas. 5,000 people gather outside the State House in Philadelphia, and they tell the captain he can't unload the tea. He has to turn around and go back. And the captain says, I'd like to do that, but I don't have enough fresh water or food to get back to England. They say, we'll take care of that. So the town reloads the ship with food and water to send it back. We're going to destroy the tea. We're not going to allow the tea to land. And so this is one of the greatest acts of civil disobedience in world history. Now, I should tell you, in January, in addition to sending the news to Philadelphia, the Patriots had sent it to London, an account of what happened. And people in London don't say, hey, this was a great thing. Isn't it great? They dressed as Indians, destroyed the tea. The tea belonged really to them. It was the East India Company's tea. Members of Parliament, some who had been sympathetic somewhat to the Americans, had lost something in this. So they really had gone too far. So Parliament gets tough. They suspend the government of Massachusetts. They're not going to have this charter anymore. And instead of having mild-mannered professorial Thomas Hutchinson as governor, they're going to have a General Thomas Gage. And the suspension of the charter also means the governor will appoint all officials, sheriffs, tax collectors, magistrates. Towns can only have a town meeting once a year, and that's with the governor's approval. It's come to their attention that these towns are almost constantly meeting, and what good comes of that? So you're going to have the British government now is constraining the government of Massachusetts in 1774. And it's really this, in 1774, the suppression of the way people have governed themselves, that's going to lead then to resistance and revolution. A lot of places that have been kind of lukewarm to the whole idea didn't really see an interest in siding with the crazy radicals in Boston. Now say, hey, wait a minute. The British government can shut down Concord's town meeting, or Leominster's town meeting, or town meetings in Framingham. It's not just because of Boston. So that is really going to be the motivating thing. The response of Parliament to this, as opposed to the fact that, hey, we really are happy they destroyed the tea.
So the folks that were, the colonists, if you will, had grown used to governing themselves. And so this is part of the reason that they were so incensed. They had
Yes, yes,
become used to it, and this was a change. If they hadn't been used to it, that would have been a different story.
exactly, exactly. In the fall of 1772, by the way, the Tea Party, dramatic, exciting, you can recreate it. But if we were talking about the precipitating events of what's behind this, we'd look at a really mundane issue. Who pays the judges? Back in 1770, you'll recall, horrid massacre in Boston, as they called it, and the British soldiers stood trial for murder. They had very good lawyers. They're acquitted. British government says, boy, we literally dodged a bullet with this one. What happens the next time? Some official in one of these colonies gets into trouble for following orders or exercising his duties. And he doesn't have a John Adams or Josiah Quincy to come along and defend him. We better do something about this. So in 1772, Parliament says, you know what? We are going to pay the judges in these American colonies. In Massachusetts, the judges will get paid by the British Crown. And this is a thing that really gets people in Massachusetts very upset, because if the Crown is paying the judges are dependent on the Crown or on Parliament, not on us. Also, the Massachusetts Charter from the 1690s says that the judges are paid by the provincial government. So you have this issue. The judges, should they accept a salary? And again, mobs turn out and go to the different judges who are holding court and tell them you can't accept a crown salary. And every judge in Massachusetts says you're right, except one, and that's Peter Oliver, who is the Chief Justice of the Superior Court, also the brother-in-law of Thomas Hutchinson. He's an iron manufacturer from Taunton. And it costs him a lot of money to serve as a judge. He has time away from his business, traveling around, going, we think judges are a pretty respectable group. Judges here, they have to travel with the court. Courts are held in taverns. And you, as the judge, then have to sleep in the tavern, maybe even sharing a bed or a room with some of the lawyers. These flea, bedbug infested, dirty taverns. And then you spend the day hearing these cases of really trivial things, like kinds of things that Judge Judy wouldn't want to hear because they're so boring and trivial. And here you are traveling around doing this, and now the Crown wants to give you an extra 200 pounds, which doesn't make up for what you're losing by being a judge as opposed to tending to your business. So Oliver says, I'll accept the salary. Well, every other judge has said, no, what do you do with a judge who refuses to go along? And John Adams, who's a member of the Assembly, says we can impeach him. And the other members of the Assembly say, we don't think that's going to work. A, we've never impeached a Crown official before. B, we impeach. There had been a big impeachment trial in London back in 1770 involving Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India. Okay, so we know what impeachment are because we had this big case. Adams says we can impeach Judge Oliver. Well, okay, so we impeach in the Assembly. The next step is the Governor's Council, which functions as the upper chamber, which would then hear the case. Well, presiding over the Governor's Council is Thomas Hutchinson. Secretary of the Council is Andrew Oliver, Peter Oliver's brother. They're going to say, you don't have the power to do this. And that'll be the end of it. Adams says, no. We have to just have to make the effort to impeach him. So they do. So they impeach Judge Oliver. And then predictably what happens is the Governor's Council says the Assembly has no power to impeach Crown officials. But then what happens is Judge Oliver goes out to Worcester to try to, hold cases. The jurors come in, they look at him, and they say, wait a minute, you've been impeached by our Assembly. We can't serve in this court until the matter's been resolved. Oliver thinks it has been resolved. The Assembly doesn't have the power to impeach. These farmers in Worcester say, no, it hasn't been resolved. The Governor's Council has to hear the case. They get up and walk out. Don't try that if you're ever on jury duty. So Oliver finds he can't impanel a jury in Massachusetts. Now, meanwhile, in Boston, the town meeting gathers, and they write a pamphlet about how British policies are violating their rights as men, as Christians, as subjects. Josiah Quincy, Samuel Adams, James Otis, Joseph Warren are among the people writing this. They send this out to the towns of Massachusetts for comment. And they also call in the towns to form committees of correspondence. So they can write to the Committee of Correspondence in Boston, formed by the town meeting. So you have these committees formed, and the town meetings that happened in the wake of this is in early 1773, go further than the Boston pamphlet had done in arguing about what their rights are as individuals. And no good man can be silent in the cause of liberty, one of them says. The town of Chelsea has this wonderful thing about how America is like a rising sun. And the only thing that can stop it is being trammeled by policies like paying the judges. This is really the background in Massachusetts in 1773. This is what people were thinking about, not what's happening with tea. Just like when Parliament was passing the Tea Act in May of 1773, they weren't thinking, how are the people in Massachusetts going to respond to this? They're really thinking about India, not Massachusetts.
Wow, you're really good at bringing this alive. What is the date again of the celebration? The commemoration, not the celebration.
Commemoration, December 16th, 1773. 2023, I'm sorry. December 16th was the date. And there will be performances happening at Revolutionary Spaces as well as their exhibit. And the Tea Party Ships and Museum, of course, is open doing things up till then. But December 16th is the big day. All kinds of things will be happening. So it should be very interesting, exciting, inspiring.
And where do you send the tea again? If you would like, if you have stale tea, you send it to get dumped over.
Tea Party Ships and Museum.
Okay.
Which is on Congress Street in Boston.
Something that you're involved in that's very exciting. I must bring it up. Is you are really involved with the Constitution Museum. You're like the head of it, aren't you?
No. I'm
well, okay.
Participant. No,
happy participant.
Anne Grimes Rand is the president of it. She does a terrific job with the
All
museum, which is a world-class museum. It's the only Boston area museum that has a Smithsonian affiliation.
All right. So something exciting going on there is they are thinking of building a new museum.
Yes.
And simultaneously you are putting together your book on the Constitution's trip around the world, which a lot of people don't know about. And they're thinking of making that concept of the Constitution's trip around the world the centerpiece of the new museum, and you're writing the book on it, so that's big for you, right?
Yeah, so we got together and they suggested I help with the thinking about why this is an exciting thing. The Constitution's real moment of glory was the War of 1812, when it had 3 major engagements with British ships. But here, it's 30 years later, it's an old ship. And it goes, and what do you do with old ships? The Navy had wanted to scrap it a couple of times. There's this public outcry about saving it, but it's unclear what are we going to do with the ship. And in 1843, it's again on the verge of falling apart, and they get an estimate. It's going to cost $70,000 to refit this thing. For $150,000, you can build a new ship, an even better ship. So the Navy's thinking, do we really want to go to that effort? A guy named Mad Jack Percival, who is from Barnstable, and he's an old guy. He is an old guy for a Navy captain. He'd only become a captain at the age of 62. He'd been a lieutenant for about 30 years. Cantankerous guy. You don't get a nickname like Mad Jack by being calm and mild-mannered. He says, I can do it for $10,000. And the Navy says, okay, go ahead. And he does. And says, so what do I do now? And they said, why don't you sail it around the world? I think the Navy was kind of hoping.
They were just hoping it would sink.
Yeah. But he does. And they go to the Brazil. And Brazil, at that time was the largest country in the New World, the only empire. And then they go to East Africa, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, China, the Philippines, and Hawaii, Mexico, and come back. So that's world cruise. They encounter lots of different people. So we're thinking this would be a good way of telling the story about the people who were aboard the ship, as well as the places they're going. About half of the crew actually were born in countries other than the United States. And there are a number of Chinese guys who get aboard the ship in New York. And then they get off when they get to China. And then in China, there are a number of guys who get aboard the ship and then get off when they get back to Boston. So you have people using the ship as a way of getting around the world, and you have stories we're able to discern from it. I've just been really working a lot with journals of these two guys. One's a midshipman and one's a lieutenant. Keep these extraordinary journals of the crews, and they don't write when they're at sea because that's kind of boring. But when they get to port, they describe the people they're seeing and what these places are like. And one of them, a guy named Buckner, actually, Washington Buckner, later he goes by William. I like to think this is actually maybe a progenitor of the Bill Buckner famous to all of us. He is from Kentucky, and he writes about missionaries. He said, well, what the missionaries should do, he talks about the bizarre customs some religions have. And he says, but this actually isn't in their religion. It's something that's been added. Maybe what missionaries should do is instead of trying to sell them on their book, sell them on their book. So have it's thinking about these people. It's lots of interesting observations of this world that they're experiencing. They go to Zanzibar, and the Sultan of Zanzibar has in his sitting room a print of the Constitution defeating the Guerriere. He's not a big fan of the British Empire. And here's and when they get to Singapore, the British admiral in charge of the fleet in Singapore is a guy named Henry Chads. Chads had been a lieutenant back in 1812 aboard the HMS Java. And when the commander of the Java was mortally wounded, Chads is the one who has to go surrender the ship to the Constitution. So now 30 years later, he's an admiral, and he sees that same ship coming into Singapore harbor. He now has much newer ships, and he says, what I would give to have half an hour with her now.
So you do talks on this topic. I've heard one. Do you have any coming up that folks could go to? Because they are really good.
I don't. I probably should, because it is a fun story, and I think I got distracted talking about it instead of writing about it. You've been good enough to listen, but it is really a fascinating series of stories about experiencing the world in the 1840s aboard this American warship.
Well, you have to let me know as soon as the book is done. I understand you have about 12 of 17 chapters done, right?
No, I have 17 of 22 chapters.
17 of 22.
So more than so close.
So that's good.
Closer than I was last time we talked.
So you've been kind of cranking away on that. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bob Allison. And again, December 16th, you might, if you're able to get here, maybe you're traveling here, maybe you live around, you might want to get involved with this commemoration of the Boston Tea Party. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, Bradley. Great to talk to you, Bradley.
Talk to you real soon.